You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Brady, joined back in our sunny studio by Billy Galanko. How are you, Billy?
Doing well. Excited for the holiday season. I have my red shirt and green pants on. Very Christmassy.
Nice. Yeah, I put the candles up, the timed battery candles up in our windows, which I like. You see them come on around 5. You know, it's time to wrap up work, and then you get them. They greet you when you come home. We have a huge evergreen tree in our neighborhood. It's probably, I don't know, it's got to be 60 feet or more. And they light it up every Christmas, and there's a big neighborhood tree lighting thing. So that's cool seeing coming in when you drive up.
Nice. I got a nice little 4.5 foot tree that fits well in our little apartment. And I think I got one that was too fresh because it hasn't started smelling at all until today. And we're going out of town tomorrow for a week until after Christmas. So I'm like, come on, tree. But
yeah,
that's
you
okay.
gotta let it die down a little bit.
I guess so. It needs to dry out a little bit, something. Who knows? But yeah, speaking of, I was going to say pine trees, and that reminds me of the Pacific Northwest, which is where we just spent a week together last week for our retreat.
Yeah, it was fun. We got to record a podcast in person, which I think we've tried to do a number of different other times. I feel like every time we've been together, we've talked about, should we try and record? And we actually did it this time. So I hope you all enjoyed that episode. Great talk. If you didn't get to it on the Asian wine market, which is really cool. But yeah, we had a good time, spent time with the team, with the entire event team, talking strategy, getting to know each other a little bit better, which is always nice, getting to kind of strategize and dream about the future in person. And also drank a lot of really great wine from some of our winemaker friends in that area, and cooked some dinner together. That was a good time.
Yeah. I think obviously most relevant to all of our listeners here and what you guys probably care about the most is the wines we drank, or are the wines we drank. So what was interesting, and Brady organized the whole thing, is we really got an overview of the Willamette Valley. Brady and another member of the team and I had gone up and visited a few different producers as for part of Vent before. Also, we had filmed a podcast or an interview. I guess it was also a podcast with Channing Frye. We had a video and a podcast. I guess they were separate couple of years ago. So it was nice to have the whole team up there. And one night we had Christy Wentz, who's a past podcast guest, come over and basically walk us through all of the different it gave us an overview of the Willamette Valley, the different AVAs, different types of soils. She had wines from different producers representing different styles. I thought that was a really cool intro for the guys who didn't know much, and also just a nice refresher for me. And she brought some really cool wines. I think my favorite was the Bethel Heights, a single block 2017. I actually got a bottle of that to bring home. So what was one of your favorites, Brady?
Yeah, on the Christie night, it had to be the Upper Terrace Beaufrere Pinot that she brought, which I think we talked about Beaufrere a little on the podcast. I actually hadn't had that particular vineyard before. I've had a few others. I've had their Willamette Valley. They make their Pinot in a style that I just really like, and so that one stood out to me on that night.
I also really like we had a Ponzi Reserve. I think it's also one of their single vineyard bottlings. That's another one I actually brought home. That one was interesting to me because it was really floral and deep in terms of complexity, I guess. So it still had some of that forest floor, but it also had a little bit of that earthiness and red fruit, and really almost high tone aromatics, or what did Adam call it? Lifted for something else. So I thought that was really cool because it ended up being like a 14.1% wine. And I was like, I didn't know the Willamette was making wines this big. And it was a few years old. It wasn't like one of the really recent, really hot vintages. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I sometimes get stuck in terms of my thinking about Willamette Pinot, whether or not, are you supposed to drink them a little bit younger because of some of the fruit characteristics? But I think some of the wines that we tasted, especially on that night, reminded me that no, you can probably let some of those wines rest and open up for a little bit. to get the most out of them. I think that's how I felt with some of those higher alcohol, maybe fruitier or darker fruited expressions. It felt like maybe I could wait a little bit longer on a few of them. And so I think that's something I want to do with some of the Pinot Noir that I have in my cellar, is just hold off a little bit on a few of them, because I think I'd been drinking them maybe a little early in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think they have the potential to develop. They may not get all of the secondary and tertiary notes that you might find a Burgundy, but I think they're like a really cool balance in between. It's like a California style and Burgundy. It still gets really ripe, but there's still definitely this earthiness and minerality and depth that harken. I hate to compare things, harkens in a Burgundian manner to me. So I think
Yeah.
I agree with you on that one for sure. I've been putting down all my.
I think it's not for me. Wanting to see a little bit of age on some of those wines isn't as much about developing secondary or tertiary flavors. It's more about just maybe letting some of that like bigness and some of that alcohol integrate a little bit better over time and soften up, maybe. Like maybe felt a little bit tight.
Yeah. So moving on. So that was like a really fun overview. I think that night we had 5 Pinots, and actually a Pinot Blanc. So we had 5 Pinot Noirs and a Pinot Blanc to start the night. And then the next 2 nights we had a really cool juxtaposition of producers. We had Jackson Holstein from Granville, and we had Thomas, what's his last name?
Sauv.
Savre, yeah, from Lingua Franca. So it's kind of really neat because they're 2 certainly premium producers, but Jackson in Granville is still really just a much smaller producer. They're producing super quality wines, primarily from estate grown fruit, whereas Lingua Franca, also super premium quality wines, but they were recently acquired by Constellation. They recently scaled some of their production of some of their vineyard designate wines. So it's been interesting to really get their perspective both on the future of the valley, how to produce great wine in the valley. To me, it was just a great learning experience all around.
Yeah, and differences in the way that they approach their winemaking style, and also, like you said, differences in the way that they've scaled their individual businesses. Granville, I'm pretty sure, I forget what percentage he said was like direct sales through their website to either club members or other folks like that. I know he does some traveling and selling, but just interesting to hear about how an investment from a company like Constellation just instantly changes the way that you think about distribution, your available markets, and things like that. Yeah, both great producers, excellent winemakers, really thoughtful in terms of how they go about their winemaking and how they think about defining this regional style, I guess, around Pinot and Chardonnay.
Yeah, and I really, it was interesting because their wines, especially the Chardonnays, a lot of their top end ones really blew my socks off. I think those were my favorite wines of the weekend. Everybody's been talking about Willamette Chardonnay getting better, and we had a couple years ago when we were there, but I really think the ones we had this weekend really started to demonstrate the potential. It really did remind me more of a white Burgundy. I think I might have mentioned on the podcast, I know you told you off, that I had I just wanted to get a baseline of what is a normal Napa Chardonnay ahead of time. So I had a Duckhorn, just like their baseline Napa Valley Chardonnay the weekend before, just to compare. And the acid, the complexity, the salinity that you found in these Willamette Chardonnays were just so much more, reminded me more of Burgundy, and just so well balanced compared to really the vanilla. And I don't want to say Duckhorn was flabby, and I know a lot of people probably really like it, but for me, it just didn't have the acid and the depth that I was really looking for in a Chardonnay. So I was super impressed by that.
Yeah, and I think the way that they treat their wines, in terms of like their French oak aging, I think really skillful in the way both winemakers approach that process. And it felt like the oak was really well integrated across those wines. Tremendous freshness, even though both of them 2 different styles. One maybe a slightly more round and oak forward style when you're talking about Lingua Franca, versus Granville, which is maybe a little bit more lifted, definitely higher elevation, right? I assume, but both, utilize oak really in a way that I think is super appealing, as opposed to maybe some of the wines that you think about farther down the coast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the mallow, I think most of them went through malolactic fermentation, but it was really well balanced if they did, still leaving a lot of freshness. It was just cool to just emphasize to our listeners how different their backgrounds are. It was interesting because the wines, in my opinion, are both comparable quality, even though people probably haven't heard of Granville before. I think he's making amazing wines, but his dad was just like a viticulturalist in the area, helped really grow the area from the ground up. Jackson grew up in that environment, whereas Thomas grew up in France, making wine in France in different locations, even had an internship at DRC. And it's so interesting that their backgrounds could be so completely different and their companies are very different, but the wines they're making are similar in style, and they both speak to the place of the Willamette Valley, which I think is just interesting to really highlight the power of the grapes and terroir. To be like, and Chardonnay from generally the same area can produce a really high tier quality wine, regardless of what the background of the winemaker is, as long as they're being thoughtful in the vineyards also and putting a lot of care in the winery.
Yeah, it was great hearing from them. We definitely have a different spectrum of knowledge about wine across our team. So really appreciated too how open they were to kind of answering all types of questions about the business, about the wines themselves. Yeah, super generous. And so, yeah, thank you to Thomas and Jackson.
Before we get to our interview, though, we have to mention the topic of the weekend, and it is the crossroads of reductive winemaking and reductive notes and minerality. Adam, our I don't know what we call now, director of wine, COO, obviously a master of wine, has shared with us his theory that if a wine is showing reductive expressions, whether it be on the nose or underwent reductive winemaking, that can enhance the perception of minerality in the wine. He still was working on what may cause what, and he's been thinking about it for years. So he brought it up, asked the winemakers, and now everybody on the team is getting into it. Brady found an article. So now it's now my mission to compare as well and figure that out.
Yeah, can you just explain reductive winemaking, what that generally means, high level?
Yeah, on a very high level, it's basically just limiting the exposure of the wines to oxygen throughout the winemaking process. For reds, it can mean something a little different. They might need a little bit of exposure at the beginning to kind of during fermentation or getting the colors and certain things going. But it's basically once fermentation is done, and typically during fermentation for whites too, just keeping the wine as protected as possible from oxygen. So whether that mean if it goes to barrel, hopping up a lot of the time, or just making sure tanks are full, and those are really high level examples, but things like that that can lead to in the bottle, it's just maybe some more expressions of certain natural sulfur compounds, things that you might smell like matchstick. Sometimes it can even smell kind of like rotten egg, but that typically blows off. So those are just a couple notes you might find. There's a lot more. This is like a whole big topic, but that's high level. Yeah.
Yeah, so we had the whole tech team and the business team on the reductive winemaking and minerality kick, which was fun.
Yeah. Cool. And then I guess one other little side note from me for the weekend, before we get to our interview, I forgot to discuss with you in person. I actually got to meet Vince Anter, who's another past podcast guest.
Mm-hmm.
This weekend, I went to his Chile launch event, which was really cool. If he's gonna have more, so if anybody follows Vias for Vino in the area where he has a new launch party, it was really neat. We got to not only meet him, but had the wines from the episode. So the producers actually donated them. So he didn't have to pay for anything. We were just paying for kind of the food that the venue had for us. And it was really great. One of the wines there was the Purple Angel, which is from Apalta, basically right next to Clos Apalta. We had a couple wines from Vic, VIK, which were also really outstanding. So we had all the wines were great, but those two really stood out to me, the Purple Angel and the Vic. I can't remember what the name of the bottling was, but it was a Carmenere forward bottling. It was a really great time. And you reminded me of it because when we were saying how the Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley kind of has these new world ripeness meeting old world minerality, that's also how I describe Chilean Sauvignon Blanc. I find it as a really nice middle ground between New Zealand, which has its crazy big tropical fruits, and like a Sancerre, like a French style that's maybe a little more mineral driven and saline. I think the Chile Sauvignon Blancs are really distinct in coming right in that middle ground and not being too new worldy.
Nice. Yeah, I picked up a Chilean Riesling the other day. I just came, and I had forgot that I ordered it, and it's in a huge, like, large punted bottle.
Wow,
it's really interesting. I forget the producer name. I picked it up because it had like some kind of high score from Tim Atkin or something like that, and I needed an extra bottle to fill my case. So I'm really excited to try it now because I haven't had a Chilean Riesling.
You need to take a picture. I've never had a Chilean Riesling either. Also, just picturing a Riesling bottle in general with a giant punt seems
It's
kind of
like
weird.
bigger than a
but
Syrah. It's like bigger than a Pinot bottle. I'll send you a picture.
Wow. All right. We'll check that out. Everybody, though, go check out Via Servino's new episode on Chile. It was really great. But for today, we will get to our main event. It is our interview with Amelia Singer. She is also from The Wine Show. If anybody watched that after we had Joe Fattorini on, she's basically the other main wine expert in the show. She does a lot of traveling. She goes to places with Joe, like Madeira. She goes some places on her own, like Australia. It's really cool episodes. But it was really just cool to get to know her. I learned a little bit more about her background. Turns out her dad was friends with Hugh Johnson, who, if anybody's a long-term listener to this podcast, they know the story of wine that I've been listening to for a year and a half now, written by Hugh Johnson. And so that was really cool to hear. She has her website, amelias-wine.com. Everybody should go check it out. She does different tasting events. She has her social media presence. She has her own podcast now called Ameliorate with Wine, I think it is. I know it's Ameliorate because through wine.
Ameliorate through wine. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But I did find it interesting. We always comment that, especially a lot of these British wine folks, I feel like they always have a really substantial connection at a young age to wine, which I always get a kick out of. And this one was like that, kind of on steroids. She was like tasting wine at the age of like 6, perfectly describing wine according to one of her stories by the age of 12. And then she decided she wanted to work in wine. So her first internship, or at least vintage she worked, was at Aubryon, which was one of the first grows in Bordeaux. And I was just like, oh, that'd be great. Like when I decided I wanted to work in wine, I just called everybody in Australia and took the one that said yes. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was great hearing from someone else in wine media who's had a lot of success, again, just like Joe, really, across a number of different mediums, TV, radio. Now she's tackling podcasting, consulted in different ways, taught in different ways. So yeah, awesome to have her on, and hope everyone enjoys.
All right. We are so excited to have our number 2, The Wine Show guest coming on. Amelia, thank you so much for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure. No, it's great to be here.
Yeah, no, we were really excited because Joe obviously brought you up, and you guys were key components of the actual wine side of that show. So we'd love to hear a little bit more. Like he touched a little bit on your background and how you built your own career in wine. It would be really cool to kind of hear about where you started, and then we can kind of talk about how you ended up on the show and some of my favorite episodes. I'm a big fan of the Madeira one and the Australia one, just because I've traveled and I worked a vintage in Australia as well.
Really?
So I thought those were really well done.
I love Australia so much. No, thank you. Yeah, so for those who never seen The Wine Show, my name's Amelia Singer. I'm a wine broadcaster, communicator, and educator. I've been in wine for now 14 years, going to get to 15. And I'm, as you can tell from my accent, I'm based actually in London. So that's where I'm tuning in right now. But my mum's actually American, Californian. So I always would spend 3 or 4 months in the States. And my dad, even though I was born here, is actually his family from Austria-Hungary. That was a thing. And I think by having that very international background was actually very formative in how I got into wine. My dad, I shouldn't be saying this, but yeah, my dad being European, I was practically weaned on wine. I was always allowed a sip of wine before dinner when I was about 6, because he just wanted to get my sister and I just appreciating it. And my sister wasn't really into it, but I love food and flavors and smells. And when I was about 10, I remember tasting a wine. I was like, oh, this wine tastes of honey, peach, and apricot. And my dad almost burst into tears. He's very emotional and was like, that's the perfect description for a Viognier. And I think it was when I was about 14, 15, we were on a family trip to Italy. I was allowed a full glass of wine with a family. But I think for me, wine was always just considered part of family life, part of family meals, good conversation, like good music in the background. And I really realized that growing in the UK and looking back 30 years, I had a very unique connection with wine and relationship with wine than most of my peers growing up in the UK. I never thought I'd go into wine, but yeah, it's interesting. And I actually was studying English literature at university and doing a lot of jazz singing and acting and writing. But I helped run the Food and Wine Society at my university as well, Trinity College Dublin. And Dublin's quite an interesting place because it was a great university, but I would say wine was like definitely not as developed as it was in England. And I remember running the Food and Wine Society and hosting a kind of wine and cheese tasting at my house. And all like my Irish mates were like, oh my goodness, that sounds really poncy. And we were just used to gathering at people's houses with beer and having trad sessions and singing and playing music. And I was like, well, guys, just bring any kind of cheese. It could be Baby Bell, and just bring any kind of wine, like even just a pretty wine, whatever, doesn't matter the price. And I would curate 3 or 4 pairings, which I thought would be nice. And then it was essentially just get people together. And it was such success, that first gathering, that I was then, it was like compelled to do it every single semester. Like everyone just loved it so much. And in my last year of university, I had all my applications to send off to drama school. And I'd already I actually had done a course at Yale, the conservatory practice course. I'd done for 3 months, and
Wow.
I'd done television alongside studying. I love extracurricular activities. And so it was all good, but my heart really wasn't in it. And I just was like, oh, I don't know. I just don't think I have the right personality for acting. Like, I believe if you work hard and, if you're good at what you do, then you deserve to do well. But I kind of already just seen a glimpse of the industry in Dublin, and that's definitely not how it works. And I think it's only worse probably in places like LA and New York. And so I went to England at Christmas time, and it was that awful period where everyone said, what are you going to do when you leave university? And I somehow, at one kind of Christmas party, I was talking to a guy, and we started talking about wine. And I said to him, I really hate how there's such a strict dichotomy with wine. People either think of it as very highly intellectualized or highly elitist subject, or the other side, which is let's just get 3 bottles of Gallo or Jacob's Creek or whatever for £10. And I was like, why can't there be like a middle way? Like, people see it as a life enhancer, like good food, good music, good conversation. And at the time, Jamie Oliver, I mean, he still is a very well-known English chef, but he was really, I would say, in his prime in the UK. And I was like, I wish I could be someone like a Jamie Oliver, because I love how he makes food so relatable. And he really empowers people in terms of the decisions of food they buy and make. And it doesn't matter their background. And this guy was obviously really bored of my chats and was like, why don't you do it then? And I've literally had a eureka light bulb moment. And I went home. It was 2008, Christmas Eve. My dad was shaving. And I went to the bathroom and I said, hey, Daddy, I've got something to tell you. And he put down the razor because he just never knows with me what I'm going to say. And I thought, what? And I was like, look, I know you would have supported me had I gone down the acting, writing route. But actually, I think I really want to use my skills in an area which is really unappreciated or not, hasn't really been done this way before. I want to work with wine, and I really want to make it even more fun and relatable. And he burst into tears, and I told you, he's very emotional, and he's so happy. I think this will in far better with your values, lifestyle you want, and the kind of people you want around you. And he was absolutely right. And he came from management consultancy background. So he's like, okay, as you're doing, you need to build up your own equivalent of an MBA. So you really need to understand the product from the roots upwards, and you need to keep getting all kinds of experience from working in wineries to exams to working in different areas of the industry. So that's what I did for the first 5 years of my career. As soon as I left university, I did a harvest at Chateau Aubryon in Bordeaux, which was amazing, and lived in Bordeaux during an iconic harvest, 2009.
Wow.
I'm sure it was thanks to my picking why it was so brilliant. No. But yeah, and then I went back and went into marketing. So I was working for Bollinger and Taylor's Port, and working in marketing and PR whilst studying for my WSAT level 3 exams, which the company paid for. And then before I went off to do my diploma for the WSAT, so for people who, I think you call it WESET, sorry. In England, we call it One for Education Trust, so WSAT courses. Before I did my diploma, which is at least a 2-year endeavor, and the highest level you can go for WSAT and the step 4 Master of Wine, I decided to take a year off to work in wineries in Spain, in Rioja, and then I went off to Chile for 6 months and worked in a winery there. And then I came back and started my diploma whilst working in wine shops, whilst working in online retail too, to understand that and helping wine come into the UK and events. it was really as soon as I got my diploma, and all of that took about 5-6 years. But I do feel that as a young woman in the industry, particularly back then, and particularly as a young woman who wanted to set up her own wine business, you kind of you have to know twice as much as the guys. Sorry, I know that. Like that's not, but it is just true. I think times have changed now, but definitely when I was in my 20s, that was definitely the case in London. So yeah, when I was 27, 28, after I got my diploma, I then set up Amelia's Wine, and there is a hyphen there in the website. Otherwise, it looks like Amelia's Swine. Not a great look. I'm glad my website developer pointed that out. And yeah, I kickstarted because for me, working in all of the different areas, the only thing I haven't done is be a sommelier because I'm extremely clumsy. I've managed to shut my ear in a car door. So I've not worked in
wow.
yeah, I'm really clumsy. So I would not be an asset to any restaurant. But yeah, I think for me, all that experience, as well as, of course, learning about the product, building up your network, which is essential, it only confirmed to me that what I really love doing is the wine education and communication. I loved events, and I loved how wine brought people together. And so, yeah, like when I first set up my business, I had a basement apartment, and I set up a wine-centric supper club called Basement Amelia. And every single week I would host, cook, and do tastings for 18 people. It just started off as a newsletter I sent around friends. And then that built. And then that's how I got private clients, corporate clients. And then Jamie Oliver, my hero, heard about this crazy girl in London holding these wine-centric supper clubs in her basement. And so then he sent his production company over. They kind of saw me in action, and they're like, she's crazy. She's perfect for our online drinks tube channel. So then I was the wine person with Jamie Oliver, and that's how the wine show kind of came about and how they heard about me. So yeah, that was how it, and then
Cool. Yeah.
that then the wine show, but which then opened up a whole nother, that was huge and helped me really move forward with my career into all kinds of areas. But yeah, the beginning was just a lot of graft and just having to kind of carve my own path, really, just because that whole idea now, because of online social media, wine communication, education has changed so much in the last 15 years. But definitely for me, the last 7 years, it was, just trying to understand the product as much as I could and build my network. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that resonates a bit with me. I kind of transitioned later in life to wine. Like I was working in digital advertising in New York. And then 2017, I took the first 2 levels of the quartermaster sommelier exams. So got to the certified. But back then I remember trying to listen to podcasts or find anything talking about wine because I actually just decided to learn from the ground up. So I was like, what are the resources? And there was 4 books and there was some podcasts, and that was basically it.
Probably be
and until you got really advanced.
Yeah, and also everything was, it was all about being a specialist also back then. It was,
exactly.
so it was all Bordeaux, Burgundy, Italy. And it's just amazing even just seeing how the curriculums have changed. So I work with the WSAT now too. I've done a 3-minute little education course. And it's just amazing just seeing now what students are learning to do their diploma. And England now, of course, being a part of the curriculum, and Georgia and all these other countries. It's so exciting. It's really great to see how much has evolved.
Yeah, I'm working through the end of the diploma now, hoping to finally finish the fortified sometime. But on my D3 exam, whatever the big one, the one with all the wines is, there was like multiple questions on the Jura, and I was like, this is crazy because like when I started, nobody knew about the Jura in the first place. So I was like, wow.
That is such a mammoth exam, that tasting day, because I remember, 3 hours of tasting, you have half an hour to eat some carbs, and then 3 hours of writing. Having done English literature as a degree, I was like, you normally do 3 hours of writing, but not having tasted various flights of wine beforehand. No, that is a marathon. It's a rigorous, good luck with it all. It is really intense, the diploma.
But we're luckily also for that exam, they break it into 2 days now. At least they did for me. So that was nice.
That's very civilized.
But before we move on, I wanted to ask how. So I understand you're like, all right, cool. I want to work in wine. I really am excited. Yeah. How did you land Aubryon as your first cellar hand job? That sounds like a big leap.
That was a huge leap. And that was because my father is very musical. And at college, he played in the orchestra with Hugh Johnson. And Hugh Johnson
Oh,
is,
wow.
yeah, yeah. So they're like really good friends and they bonded over both being able to play the French horn. And they just remained really good mates after school. And yeah, so it was Hugh Johnson put me in contact. So again, that was like, I was so lucky to have that connection. And so that's exactly because actually, particularly, back then, I don't think, and I'm still not even sure how open France is to various schemes in terms of internships working on wineries. I know the New World, like I know Australia is much more open-minded to having people come and work, and South America was much
Mhm.
easier for me to get a gig. Definitely when I went to work in Spain and France. Well, Spain was because I worked at the winery with their wines in the UK. That was my connection to get into Rioja. But yeah, France was again, it might be more open now. But I definitely think, yeah, there's just more of a history with places like the States and Australia and even South Africa accepting people to come work and do the harvest or work in the winery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that took my comment, the Aubryon internship, because it feels so many people we talked to that said, "Yeah, I decided to go into wine, and I got my start at Petrus, and then
No,
I can't imagine just stepping
I was
into a big
exactly.
house."
And that was like, as I say, it was like due to my dad playing like the French horn.
Yeah,
And again, I do think, and that's something I've just agreed to be a mentor. We're having this cool incubator program called Drinclusive in the UK, because I also spent a lot of time in the US, working 2018 to 2021 and in wine and media. And I do find the US is much better at electives and kind of mentorship schemes and scholarship schemes. And the UK is a bit behind in that, but we've just got this new program. And I immediately signed up to be a mentor because, again, it's like whether it's connecting people to your network, whether it's just advising them that if they're a freelancer, how to protect themselves or the do's and the don'ts or any kind of guidance. I was so thankful for 2 or 3 people who I was introduced to very early on. And I think, yeah, because the wine world there isn't, if you don't want to buy or sell wine, you want to do something a bit different, then there's not exactly like a fixed route, which in some ways is fantastic. And there's now so many opportunities with podcasts and online routes and all kinds of content creation and all kinds of writing opportunities. So I would say there's more opportunities than ever, but it's still not a conventional career path. And it can be quite overwhelming for those people. Yeah, for a lot of people and a lot of different communities.
yeah, and it seems like too that there's still opportunity. And I haven't been around wine and wine education for 15 years, but it seems like even recently there's become maybe closer alignment with the consumer in terms of meeting them where they're at and not dumbing down information or presenting something that's maybe way too in the weeds. I think there's still a lot of opportunity to find that middle ground for consumers.
Absolutely. And I do think the wine show kind of hit that quite nicely. There were like serious, amazing wines and serious people and wines, but it was brought, I loved how wine was very much a thread of the show, but it was very much like a kind of travel cultural show, I would say, just as much a wine show. And I think that's why many more people could relate to it. How, whether they were wine connoisseurs or wine enthusiasts, or even some of my friends who don't even drink, they just enjoyed it from the travel cultural side and the stories, quite frankly.
Yeah, that's kind of how I got my partner originally into watching it a little bit more than some of the other wine shows that put her to sleep. Um, so on the note of the wine show, before we move on, what were some of you traveled the world obviously for different parts? I didn't realize you had so much. I mean, I guess I watched your California episode. I didn't realize it was like inherently rooted with you. But where were some of the most interesting places you traveled as part of that show?
I think definitely Australia. I'd never been to Australia before. And when I started working at the wine show, I was first of all like a researcher. And one of my main things there,
Mm,
or I started filming, was I said I really want to cover climate change, and I really want to talk sustainability and climate change and all of that. So I was like very excited to go to Adelaide University, meet the professors, see what they were doing and how it's very much a reality back then. And we filmed that several years ago, but they were already coming up with all kinds of ingenious techniques and ways using technology or even just canopy management, whatever, to deal with it. But I think also what surprised me so much about Australia was just the immigrant history and going to those kind of Germanic towns and Lutheran kind of towns, and just really, because I there is a bit of a snobbery between the UK and Australia, where we're like, oh yeah, that's where all the convicts were sent. And like that's kind of our view of Australian history, which is like, when we say it semi-jokingly, it depends who's like playing an athletic game at the time. But yeah, just for me to be like, oh my goodness, and yeah, just to actually see these towns, see the architecture, see the cultural food, see all these old vines too, which have been like preserved from the Italian community, from the Portuguese community, from the German communities. I had no real appreciation of that before. And that for me was just such fun uncovering. There were some topics which I knew absolutely. I was like, yeah, this is like where the scientists are and I want to be covering this. Da, 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 da. And then Tasmania was wild. I really want to go back there. We didn't have enough time. I think we only had 3 days filming. And again, we went there ostensibly to look at climate change and, you know, how some of the most exciting Pinot Noir and aromatic white wines and sparkling wines have been made. And I was already a huge fan of Jantz, I'm not pronouncing that right, but sparkling wine from quite a few years back. But then the history there's a real kind of, which we didn't delve into in the show, but I was just like, my dark side comes out. I was like, oh my gosh, driving around kind of wind-whipped island and you suddenly see these colonial buildings built in the trees and you're kind of like, oh my goodness, that whole history is like another side. And I want to come back and explore that. So it was amazing. Like, we were following stories which I knew we'd be covering, and then there were just a whole bunch of other kind of cultural issues which popped into my head and my imagination, which all added to the experience.
Yeah, that completely resonates with me because, like I said, I worked at Vintage, but it was in a larger winery. It was an area called the Limestone Coast, so it's basically kind of near Coonawarra.
Oh yes, I thought I
there was
really want to go over there. Yeah,
yeah, so that was cool. But I was able, like, while I was down there, I drove from Sydney, and I have a buddy who actually makes wine in Adelaide. So then I was able to drive to all of these regions. So I just like you were saying, I had no idea the depth of the history, even the Yarra Valley or Kings Valley that's nearby. It's like there's all these immigrant routes that are really well preserved that you don't think about at all. And then I got to do a loop of Tasmania as well for a week, and yeah, that's high on my list to go back for sure.
Yeah, I want to go to back.
And the wines were great.
The wines are great. The markets are great. I want to go back to that amazing modern art museum in the caves. I really want to go back because I didn't have a chance there. But no, it was absolutely fascinating. And I didn't even get to Margaret River, which now they have a direct flight to Perth from London, which will be great.
Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah, people forget how big Australia is. They're like, you were down there. I was like, I was basically in the equivalent of, I don't know, where Alabama is. I needed to get to like San Francisco. Like, you can't just hop over in a car or get there. It's so far. Cool. So after the wine show, that kind of, I guess that got you a little bit more exposure there. So what have you built since then? What are your current kind of projects? What are you most excited about right now?
I think that immediately gave credibility. Again, I was like in my late 20s. And then so I then was asked to be a wine writer for Waitrose Food Magazine. Waitrose is a premium supermarket and they have the number one food magazine in the UK. So that's where I could really cut my chops, kind of wine writing, and then get asked to do other writing. I then was also made ambassador for a couple of regions, like for the Rhone. I was made ambassador for the Rhone Institute and also the California Wine Institute, which was awesome because most of my family lived on that coast. We're originally sixth generation, actually Californians, originally from Mendocino. Not with grapes, sadly apple orchards, probably weed, I don't know. But that seems to be a common thing there. And I've been told to say the party family line is apple orchards, and but now they will come to Southern California and Central Coast. But so that was wonderful. And then also during this whole period, again, for me, wine is so much more than the alcoholic beverage. It's very much, it connects people, but it's also the stories behind the wine and the culture. And I've always considered wine literally to be one of the arts. And like the arts, like classical music, opera, art, theatre, literature, a lot of these come with a bit of stigma and prejudice. And a lot of people feel intimidated or overwhelmed. So also during this time, I started building up collaborations and partnerships with various artistic organizations in the UK, like with Garsington Opera, Opera Holland Park, City of London Symphonia, and I would pair and do these kind of wine and music, wine and literature, wine and art, where either focusing on the stories of the artists or the terroir or the styles or whatever, we'd create these kind of special evenings to reach a wider audience. So that was very much, I started doing a lot of those kind of evenings. I think probably the craziest event I did was actually in California. I was asked to do this is before he got cancelled, FYI. In 2017, I was asked to do the interpretation of Kanye West through Spanish wine in a contemporary art gallery in Laguna Beach. And what I loved about
in
that
Laguna
event,
Beach of all places too,
Yeah.
a place that deeply understands, I'm sure, Kanye and Spanish wine to begin with.
and Spanish wine and contemporary art, I was
Wow.
like, this is so mad. Ticket, and they were also getting in a chef from Chef's Table. I can't remember his name now, but a very well-known Spanish chef to do all of the food pairings to go with the wines. And I just thought, this is going to be a bit crazy. And we were in this contemporary art gallery, and we had an artist. We chose 5 songs. She then painted, 5 paintings inspired by these songs, which are hung on the walls. And we had one white wall free to project the music video, so I could speak about. Bearing in mind, I didn't really listen to Kanye when I was growing up. I was probably more of a Mary J. Blige or a Lauryn Hill or whatever. But anyway, I love doing research, doing a deep dive. And so I was like, okay, cool. Let's talk about not just the music, but him as a producer and an artist and whatever. And then link that to the structure of Tannin and Rioja or whatever. But what was amazing was these tickets sold for $100 or $90, like not cheap, but we were sold out. And when I looked in the audience, there were people of all ages, all ethnicities. And I went round at the end and I was like, would you normally go to a wine tasting? No. Or would you normally go to this? And would you normally go to a contemporary art gallery? And they were obviously Kanye fans. And they're like, well, yeah, we drink wine. We like Kanye, but this is the first time we really go into an art gallery. And that's what I've always really loved, the cross-pollination element for me with wine. And for me, wine is very much a vessel to combine all these elements and bring people together and create that community. I've always found that very stimulating. And so then I came over to the States 2018 to work on a wine and media project, which with the producers of The Voice to create content, wine content. And then we'd actually sell wine companion cases to accompany the wine content. And sadly, COVID got in the way, invested, whatever, all of that kind of went down through. But I learned a lot from that experience and got a chance to live in LA. And my grandmother was quite sick at the time, so I got to look after her during that time at least. But I'm now still working with the producers on The Voice for a project which came to us in 2020, literally a week before COVID hit, which is a competition called Wine Rival. And it's basically this, it's the idea of treating wine tasting as an athletic or a competitive sport. And anyone can enter and they taste the wine. There's prizes to be won. And it had been held in Chicago. That was where it was born by this guy called Adam Sweeters. And he'd come up with the concept, I think it was probably in 2018, 2017. And he approached me in 2019. And I was like, this sounds mad. He'd been doing it as an event where it started off as a kind of food and drink festival for the first hour with over 500 wines, which people could taste. And they have a stage. And then you have 64 contestants. And you'd have the eats, whatever, and you'd have a judge, you'd have the wine judges, and you'd have a host, and they'd win for money, whatever. And he kind of told me about it. He's like, you have to be part of it to understand it. And because of COVID, obviously it didn't happen in 2020 or 2021, but I went back to Chicago in October 22, and I saw in action. We kind of took over this old kind of rock music venue. And there were 300, 400 people in the audience who'd signed up so that they could meet winemakers and have all these amazing kind of food, kind of market stalls of food and try all the wines. And then these 64 contestants. And it's funny because at first when you have various contestants come up, and we tend to have 2 contestants kind of go against each other in 2 pairs at a time. And in the first round, like first few rounds, no one's really paying attention. And when it got to the last 15 people and then 10 people, there was like positive silence in the whole auditorium. It was nuts because I was like, can blind tasting really have the gravitas of a kind of competitive athletic sport? And there were people whooping, there were people taking sides. There was one woman who was wearing sneakers, which would look like cheeseburgers. And she got through to the final round. And everyone was like, cheeseburger girl, cheeseburger girl. And I was like, oh, this is mad. I love this. And we live streamed to the producer of The Voice, and they were like, this is insane. And so then this year, what we've been doing is hosting kind of satellite events of Wine Rival. We had the first one in June. And again, anyone can enter, but the person who won that round, and it was $2,000 if you won that particular satellite event, and a guy called Max Goldberg, who's a fantastic sommelier in LA, won. And then we did a kind of satellite event in Napa, and actually another a lovely guy called David Zolkowski won. He's a great sommelier too. And then we had the huge final in Chicago where the prize money was $25,000. And again, anyone could enter, 64 people. And out of the 3 male sommeliers, there was like 4 people who got through. 3 of them sommeliers, 1 from New York, 2 from the West Coast. But the person who actually won was a lady who had, I think, done her level 3 WSAT. She worked for a drinks depot in Chicago. She was Polish. Her English was okay, and she won. And it was just like, I love that. That for me, that whole narrative that anyone can taste. And everyone was so excited for Kasha, and that's great. So we're working on getting that filmed and bringing that hopefully to the screens next year. So that's a big project which I'm doing in the States at the moment, which I think is really fun. Pitching wine as a sporting event is really cool. And again, this is where UK is slightly behind the US. I think the US is slightly they're more opened to kind of positioning wine in that way. I would say in terms of how consumers, I don't like using the word consumers, how drinkers see wine can now be positioned in a much wider arena. But to go that whole step and to have it, that kind of prize money and that kind of level of positioning, the US is great for. And I feel very lucky to have one foot in both countries, really. And then going back to your original question, what I'm doing now, since moving back to the UK at the beginning of 22, LA's changed a lot. And I still have my O1 visa, so I can go over and work there. But I think it really made me realize being trapped in LA for the whole of 2020, unable to do events, hospitality, media, and it was very, very strict, the lockdown in LA. So I had a lot of thinking time on my own, living above a garage in West Hollywood. And it really made me realize I really miss the bringing people together. I miss the wine and culture elements. I miss the wider conversations people can have through wine. And so since coming back to the UK, it's not a rebrand. I call it a glow up because it's still me. It's still Amelia's -wine. It's still all my values, but it's just like now I'm a bit older. I'm just very much leaning into what I get excited about wine and how I think it can create communities. And so, yeah, I've got the new website, and then the new podcast is very much a synthesis of all of my experiences, ameliorate through wine, because I like puns. I also believe that wine is about making life better. I also believe that I love wine, but I like the wider conversations through wine. And so what my podcast essentially does is have people who are huge talent or leaders in their field. They could be astrologers, they could be actors, they could be musicians. And they come to my house and I make them lunch and I pair 3 wines to them based on their palate, personality, and personal story. They learn about wine and they see wine in a new way. And then you also learn about them in a new way. And I always have 1 wine from a supermarket and then 2 wines from independent or an online retailer to support various aspects of the industry. So that for me, we've just launched the first series. The 7th episode comes out this week, but it's already done well. And it's in the top 12% actually of globally for podcasts, I just got told. So I think, again, it's about making wine relatable and fun. And I think Joe might have mentioned it, but definitely with the wine show, we wanted to create content which would appeal actually to people who weren't from the wine industry. So actually, I don't expect the wine industry to tune into the podcast. Some have, and they loved it. But equally, it's not meant to be really cerebral and technical. Of course, we deal with some serious wines, and I go through certain techniques that certain guests say, I don't even know how to taste wine. I love it when guests say that I can do that. But yeah, I just love making wine linked to those people in either in a personal connection or linking wine to music and talking about their creative process and then linking it to winemaking processes. I did that recently with some punk rockers, and that was really cool. And they were like, biodynamic calendar. Maybe we should factor this in. Maybe on root days, those should be our writing days, and fruit days should be like our performance and most expressive days. And I'm like, absolutely, go for it. Like that's great.
That's
You've
wild.
been
Yeah.
you've done so many different types of media. Has just went curious because obviously we're doing a podcast now.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges with the podcast versus some of the more traditional TV media, or has it just been overall really refreshing
Definitely.
and exciting to
Well,
take that on?
okay, like you guys know, there are so many podcasts out there. When I say we're in the top 12%, that does not mean anything in terms of numbers. I mean, it's very different. And it's not like I've got thousands and thousands of followers. And obviously I would love to get more as the series grows. I think the challenge is that there are so many podcasts out there, and how does one kind of promote it? And, you can use social media to a certain extent. I luckily had some really good PR people behind, which landed some national coverage, press articles. But I think that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge because obviously it's not visual. And you guys are very good at taking videos of podcasts. For me, my first series was very much, okay, I'll do behind the scenes snapshots and take pictures, but I haven't actually done the whole video of the podcast. I do think, for the next series, I probably need a YouTube channel and be uploading this so people can watch it and make it more visual. So that, and also another big challenge is that my parents and their friends I know would love some of the content, but lots of them don't even know how to get a podcast. Like I've had to teach so many of my parents for late 60s, early 70s, who I know would get a real kick out of it and who've loved previous events I've done, or who've loved the wine show. So they love some of the discussions, but they just don't even know about podcasts. So I'm like, how do I make this easy? I'm like, okay, sign up to my newsletter. We will deliver this to your inbox every week. You try and make it as easy as possible, even though they seem like very simple logistical issues, which I'm just like, oh yeah, what seems so natural to me, millennials and of course Gen Zers or whatever, to that generation who I still think would get a lot out of it. To lots of them, it's not that intuitive. That definitely was something which I learned too. And then, but in terms of, I would have to say that the pluses outweigh the kind of negatives. I love being someone who literally, because of the COVID and because of living on my own and having to pivot my business online and having to spend my whole life online for so much of 2020, 2021. And I actually took myself off social media for 3 months because I just felt really overwhelmed. And I'm not someone who likes being online the whole time. I love doing my Instagram lives though, and I love doing my webinars. I like anything with conversation. But what I find very exhausting and overwhelming and sometimes demoralizing is you are a slave to the algorithm. And I also don't like how reductive everything's about 30-second clips. And I'm a loquacious perfectionist, so that really does not work well for me. And so I found it extremely reductive. And then I think also why I wanted to get a podcast out there and why I now use the title of wine culturalist, which sounds a bit wanky. But then I think when people see what I do, they're like, oh, she means she'll do pairings with Harry Potter for Christmas, as well as talk about wine and music. It's not like when I say culture, I'm talking high culture. I'm talking about all aspects of the cultural zeitgeist. And I love how the podcast can encompass all of that. And you do get meaty conversations. You can really get into it and people relax into it too. And I also think by putting out a podcast, for me personally, on my mental health, it gave me a product to put out there. Whereas, I didn't want to just be seen as a wine influencer talking about wine, because then you are a slave to the algorithm. Or a slave to social media. Whereas actually, if you have a product, then you can have a strategy and you can be like, look, I'm not going to focus too much on the numbers, otherwise I'll go insane. And it changes the whole time. But as long as I know what I believe in and I'm consistent with the content and consistent with the output and the messaging, then I can make this kind of medium work for me. That for me is a big thing, making social media be part of my strategy as opposed to the strategy in itself. Because that for me was a real headache for a couple of years.
That makes sense. Yeah. I'm in LA too, so we were here during the pandemic, and we basically tried to leave as much as possible or
I
be
can't
outside.
drive.
But yeah,
I couldn't drive, so I was stuck.
Oh,
I know.
yeah. No, that's the problem. Yeah, especially when you couldn't fly. Yeah. I have a couple of questions. I don't want to take too many steps back, but I have to know, one, what were the wines that you ended up pairing with the Kanye thing? Because I've been thinking about that since. Two, how did the wine rival thing actually work? Was it was the ultimate goal identifying the wine? Was it describing the mechanics of that could go anywhere. I'd be fascinated to learn a little bit more.
Okay, I'm really sorry. I have had a complete mind blank because there were like 5 Spanish wines. It was definitely a Rioja and a kind of aged Rioja. And now I must admit that I have amnesia before 2018. I just like the world in sepia pre-COVID in that time. Okay, I'm going to have to dig up my notes and I will send you them because I know I have them lurking around somewhere. So sorry to disappoint on that answer. In regards to Wine Rival, it was like WSAT kind of standardized testing. You'd have to try and guess the grape. You'd have to try and guess the country. You'd have to guess whether it was below or above a certain alcohol level. The one thing which was really left, which could be more subjective, was the acidity level in wines, and trying to guess was it high acid, was it medium acid, was it low acid, medium minus, and then you had to guess the country from where you thought it was too, and those rounds are added up. And then when you got into the crunch round, because before it was all written on, we gave them 3 minutes per wine, and then it kind of got round. Then you had to do 2 wines, and so I was sitting at the table with them, and then for the finalists, what we did for the final 4 was they had to come out and do 2 wines, but they had to actually say their answers out loud in a microphone to the crowd. The others were in a soundproof room, and which again is quite scary. But yeah, so there was absolutely standardized testing on these very objective descriptors of wine. And the people with the most amount of points, they won. And it's crazy because there's so much, again, what we do too to make it into a show, because it's all about the different stories behind these. We've had firemen enter, nurse enter in 2 of the previous competitions before we started filming it. Actually, in the past, a plastic surgeon has won, and I think a dentist has won. There's obviously something in that analytical break. They'd be like kind of, I don't know whether it was, but it was always like people with a kind of medical background, a medical sciencey background, who've managed to beat people in the wine industry in the past. But we also love to gather stories on the contestants and build that up. And also what is interesting too is like when you see people get maybe a little bit cocky and maybe they allow themselves to start drinking at the food and wine event, which is happening around there. So they'll have done 3 perfect rounds, perfect scores. And then by the time they get to one of them, I'm not going to say who, but in the sound like they lost it because they've been too confident, allowed themselves to drink a bit. And then suddenly their focus was just completely off. Or you get the people who overthink it or second guess. And I think I definitely fall into this category. I'd be really bad at it. I'd be really bad at SATs. I'm really glad in England we don't have SATs, because I'm someone who'd be like, oh no, it wouldn't be that because it'd be too easy. It would have to be that. And I wouldn't go with my gut. So that's definitely, as a judge at the beginning, each of the judges gives a piece of advice, and I always just say, just go with your gut. Overthink it. Don't think we're trying to kid you, and a lot of psychology going on behind it too, which I find fascinating, and which I think makes good viewing.
Yep. Yeah. I've run into that same situation in my exams, just tasting. It always works out better when you just go with what you think it is.
Yeah.
Or not try to guess the games that they're playing with you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that could be a whole...
And sometimes we even shove in the same wine. So sometimes we can be mean like that. Sometimes we'll use a wine again and say a wildly different answer. But there's no rules with that. We could, you could easily get the same wine again in another round. Yeah, it is interesting.
That would drive me insane if you just kept putting the same wine in. Well, I have to, and one other question, and I'll let Brady hop back in, is so you are, if I guess you said, an ambassador in that realm for the Rhone Valley. How have you seen, I guess I'm a big fan of Rhone wines. I think they're underrated as a whole, but I guess I have 2 parts. One is how have you seen their trajectory in terms of demand or popularity go up based on just the quality that they offer per value, especially. Also, if you have family, like you said, and you're helping some people in California as well, how have you seen the Rhone wine fad? I feel like the Rhone Rangers really got famous in Paso Robles, and now it's like Cab is king again there. And how have you seen the Rhone wines and the varieties oscillate in California too? I guess that's a 2-part question. But.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I stopped my ambassadorship when I went to state, kind of 2018, but definitely since I've been back in the UK and just seeing the market that way. I think more and more people are getting into the Rhone because of the value for money and the consistency of the vintage. And with climate change and stuff, it's still proving to be a very consistent region for wine lovers. And with Burgundy being ridiculously expensive, with Bordeaux, yes, of course, you can get great value for Bordeaux. Like if you want that extra kind of personality, or again, I would say style of Bordeaux is changing a lot too, with the inclusion of new grapes and various new enologists coming onto the scene. What you'd say is a classic Bordeaux, that's even becoming harder, I would say, to maybe define in more recent vintages. I would argue for certain chateaus. Controversial point, but interesting. And so I would say the Rhone for me. And I also think rosé from the Rhone, people are getting more interested in kind of like bolder rosés. Definitely if you're talking about wines for Christmas or Thanksgiving, people are like, oh yeah, rosé, like a kind of Tavel rosé or like Southern Rhone rosé actually is fantastic with this festive fare and works far better than a huge can, for example. And so I think, again, people's perceptions of wine styles, people having to be careful with their budget. We have a huge cost of living crisis here in the UK. I know you guys haven't been hit quite as badly, but like even actually, oh my God, that rosé, I had to actually comment in the Times and the Mail about this rosé. It was the Perrin chicken wine, that, you know, that rosé, which has the old farm, the Vie Ferme, and it's got a chicken on the front, and it's a rosé, and it sells for about $10 at Whole Foods and Trader Joe's. That rosé has gone viral. Like it was on TikTok about 2 or 3 months ago. And it's crazy because again, in the past, I think people would have been like, oh my goodness, it's darker than your classic Whispering Angel or whatever. But I think in terms of people are now seeing it, oh no, rosé with food. It's not just a swimming pool wine, and it's half the price of a Whispering Angel or Hampton Waters or whatever else. So that's also been interesting too. Seen all kinds of generations embrace it, thanks to different mediums.
I wonder on that point if we bring this up in various capacities almost every podcast now, but like the quote unquote natural wine movement. I'm in Silver Lake, so we have a ton of natural wine bars around us. And I feel like a lot of people who are just getting into wine or have preconceptions of wine now see all these colors that wine can be, regardless of what it tastes like.
What?
I feel like you're seeing a lot more very light reds, oranger ones. I feel like maybe that's potentially helping the acceptance of some of these weirder colored wines.
And chilled reds, you know, the concept that you can have like chilled reds. You know, I think that too, that concept that yes, you can have gastronomic, really beautiful wines, darker in color, which you put in the fridge and which go fantastically well with a barbecue or whatever. Definitely. I think that helps too. Yeah. And actually even just
I think I was just gonna say the emergence over the last, I don't know, I guess maybe it's 2010 forward of the concept restaurant or the concept bar, and these sort of like chic, cutesy places where people can go in big cities to drink wines like these. Is probably aided in exploration for consumers, maybe Billy-Nye's age, and such, who aren't going to order a bottle of wine at a steakhouse, but will go and have a cocktail and a natural wine and a rosé or something at a chic little bar.
And when
there's
you go
more
to
of that now.
Yeah, and when you go to these little bistros with charcuterie boards and pâtés and cheese boards, the Rhone, quite frankly, I would go for that over, I would say probably Burgundy or whatever. I'd want something a little bit gamey or savory or earthy or a bit rustic. So I think you're right.
Okay, so you have your podcast and you're doing the other pieces on Amelia wines. Sorry if I'm getting the name of the website
Amelia's
wrong.
Wine. Yeah, Amelia's Wine. Yeah, and I'm hopefully coming to the States too, not only to do Wine Rival, but I'm wanting to get some American guests on for series 2. Some musicians and some people in media and hospitality. So I'm planning on coming to LA around March, I think, next year, which will be fun. I can see my family and I always try and go to LA at least 2 or 3 times a year now anyway, because I say I've got the O1 and then we'll be doing some more stuff with Wine Rival again in Chicago as well. And it's always great fun. I have not yet been back to New York since the pandemic. That was the last place I'd been. I was literally there. And then I flew into LA, and that was then the day they shut everything down because of COVID. And I'm curious to know I don't know if you guys can enlighten me on what the wine restaurant scene is like there post-COVID.
I haven't been in nearly a year, but I've been back a few times since. And I'm going again in March. And from what I saw from even right afterward, I guess, I don't know, when things started opening up 2021 or so more, 2022, it had opened up a lot more. And what I thought was interesting was the overlap of still having like the sidewalk extra space for some of the restaurants. So there was actually like some of the places that I used to find that were really hard to get into. And I lived there for 2.5 years, where
Okay.
they actually had more availability, albeit you're sitting on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think some of that's changing, but it seems to be bouncing back really well. I'm excited to go in March. I'm going to be there with a bunch of buddies and do a little weekend crawl thing. So I think it'll be nice to be able to go. But all my favorite places survive. Not all my favorite places survive, but most of them. I think it bounced back pretty well. But it was definitely a challenge for some of the smaller, more niche places. I know you have a lot of in-person or other educational experiential things in the UK. Say a lot of our listeners are US based. Is the best thing for them to do to keep up with you, aside from the podcast, follow on social? Or are you doing like more like mini digital series that people can
Yeah.
keep up on? Or what's the best way to kind of keep tabs?
Yeah, I do have an online wine course. It's a bit like Masterclass, but it's with a company called Learning with Experts, which is the UK kind of version. So if people do want to learn about wine, I do have an online wine course where I've devised about 5 or 6 hours worth of lesson covering different components of that. And I have like a little 3-minute wine course on the WSAT website too. But then, yeah, I do have a newsletter, which people can subscribe to on my website, which is Amelia's-wine. Or you can just think of Amelia Swine and just remember to put in the hyphen so it doesn't look like that. And then, yeah, I'm pretty regular on Instagram. As I say, I've got, so the 7th episode of the podcast is coming out this week. Then the last episode will come out for the first series on the 3rd of January. It's actually me doing a bonus episode with my dad because he got me into wine. So he's a special guest. But then I'm hoping then I'm going to do a little bit of a podcast detox for January. And then, yeah, we'll be starting up again. And then, yeah, I do, as I say, I will be coming back to the States to do the podcast, do some filming. And I probably will be bringing back Instagram Lives, but just once a month, because I love that interactive element. And I really miss, actually, I did have a lovely US community who still absolutely follow my posts and are very supportive of the podcast and things like that and sign up to the newsletter. But I miss these conversations. And that's why I love podcasts so much. But for me, it's just, having those authentic, cool conversations with people. So I'm going to be working on ways of developing that too next year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. And we hope, a lot of our listeners will go and listen, because I checked out a few episodes and I thought they were really fascinating. And it's like, there's a lot of people trying to do things a certain way. And I think there's room for everybody if they can add these unique perspectives. And I think yours just has a take that I hadn't seen before. So I thought it was really interesting.
Oh, thank you guys so much. This has been such fun. And I applaud you guys too. I love your kind of business model. And I think it's awesome. And as you say, I think it's all about knowing what your values are and what you're offering and staying consistent to that and thinking long term as opposed to short term with all of these things, which you guys are great at.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And knowing they'll evolve. Yeah. We're still learning every day, and this will be 108, I think, or 109. So
amazing.
Yep, keeping going.
Congratulations. That's great.
Yeah. Thank you. I feel you on the detox. Maybe we'll have a little one of these times, but, awesome. Well, thanks again for your time, and we appreciate you joining.
Thank you so much. Take care, guys. Have a lovely Christmas. Bye.
All right. That was our interview with Amelia Singer. Everybody go check her out on The Wine Show and check out Amelia's-wine. You can also follow her on all her social media handles and her Ameliorate Through Wine podcast. It was great to have her on. I'm looking forward to potentially meeting up with her when she comes out to LA. We chatted a little bit after the episode. It turns out she is very good friends with the owner, or the past owner, of one of my favorite wine bars, who we're also going to have on the podcast in January, Matt Kaner. So everybody gets excited for that interview. And I hope everybody has a great holiday. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.